Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Omar Ben Yedda. I'm the group publisher here at ICE Publications, publishers of New African magazine. I'm delighted to have you here today for a very important conversation. For all of you who are joining us today, we'll be sending you the latest issue of New African, which had a special UN General Assembly edition focusing on the Sustainable Development Goals. Key to the Sustainable Development Goals will be is our food security and obviously 16 other goals, but food security will be key to ending poverty. And today, food security is a big issue on the continent for a number of reasons, not least due to exogenous shocks that are aggravating an already difficult and contentious situation. The statistics and the facts are well documented. Africa's net food import bill is around $50 billion, more or less. We are disproportionately impacted by climate change. Food as a proportion of income is extremely high, maybe 15% or so in Western Europe. That's probably increased a little bit given the cost of living crisis. But it's about 50% in Africa, so three and a half times as much. We've seen the war in Ukraine last year has had a number of effects and impacts, and possibly bigger impacts than COVID. And my panelists will correct me if I'm wrong, but we saw volatility in commodity prices, especially grains and edible oils. We saw an increase in the price of energy, namely oil and gas. We saw an increase in the price of fertilizers. And something we'll be addressing with one of our speakers, Dr. Wanjira Matai, it has changed policy and targets in terms of climate change by the biggest polluters, and something that isn't really being talked about on the food security front, but will have an impact in terms of Africa, which, as I said, is disproportionately impacted by climate change. And all this came on the back of 2 complicated years where we dealt with a global health pandemic. COVID disrupted global supply chains. It gave rise to resource nationalism, including in the area of food. We saw restriction of movement, which meant goods couldn't get from farm to markets. So wars and decisions in the West, they do impact the continent. Unfortunately, because it's Africa and it's Africans, it seems to matter less, which is why we need greater accountability as Africans, and we need to take control as much as possible of our own destiny. And we'll get to some of these points in terms of resolving our own internal issues on the continent. I'll break down the discussion essentially into 2 parts. So shocks, exogenous shocks, and what they mean, and how we've dealt with them and what we need to do. And then focus on building resilience, and really building resilience in a way that is sustainable. So without further ado, one bit of housekeeping is that people can ask questions in the comment section on the right, I believe it is, of the top right of your screens. And yes, so let's get chatting. There's a lot to discuss. I'm delighted to have people who both interest me in terms of what they've said and what I've read about them, and we featured most of you in terms of our magazines. So and there's a lot to unpack in terms of global geopolitics and food security. So I'll introduce in no particular order Dr. Innocent Musa Bimana, who's the Chief Agriculture Technologies Officer and TAT Coordinator, and we'll explain a little bit more about what TAT is shortly, of the African Development Bank and former Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Agriculture of Rwanda. We've also got Boaz Kaziri, who's Head of Policy and Advocacy at the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, an institution that we've worked very closely with. We've got Professor Edgar Gitua, who's a professor at Stratford University in International Relations, and Dr. Wanjira Matai, who's the Managing Director for Africa and Global Partnerships at the World Resources Institute, who's written for us previously and who's very vocal on a number of these issues. So I believe we're all online. Fantastic. We've got you all. Good. So maybe let's start with Innocent, if you may, and don't forget to unmute yourself. But Innocent, and I will talk in terms of what the bank is doing on the agricultural front in terms of building resilience. I know that the TAP program is highly successful, even though it needs to be scaled up ultimately. But I wanted to understand the ramifications of exogenous shocks or external shocks, especially the conflict in Ukraine, and why you saw the need as a bank to put together an emergency facility, And what was the impact that you were foreseeing at the time when you put together this emergency facility? So what were you anticipating and what were you trying to avert? So why are we so reliant ultimately to, or why do we have to respond to something that was happening so far away from where we are?
Thank you, moderator. Good day, wherever you are, and I will be going straight to the last part you said of your intervention in terms of the emergency part, the intervention of the bank. So, and then maybe with the discussion I can touch on also on the third, but they are interlinked. So for the uh, African Emergency Food Production Facility, it is actually a facility that was put in place by the bank back mid of the last year, and it was coming mostly from as a response to the disruption of supply, mostly of agro inputs, rising from the Russia-Ukraine conflict, coupled with residual effects coming recently with COVID-19 and ongoing climate change. Um, so through the bank financing facility that you have is about loan or grants that we mobilize internally the resource to support regional member countries, and the emergency facility financial support tuned to 1.5 billion to prop up and really bolster the agriculture production in regional member countries, 36 of them. And mostly, this was, as I explained, was mostly to tackle the issue of aggressively increasing production at this particular time, and also that disruption of agro input, fertilizer and seed. That we know are key drivers to respond to the productivity. To this effect, what we are planning to say through this facility to supply around 400,000 metric tons of seed to regional member countries, and also around 3 million of fertilizer to regional member countries. But we realize that it's not only on this input, but it's very important to look at the structural issues, specifically policy reforms that are also being supported and through this facility, mostly for the easy movement of seed and fertilizer supply as regarded to availability and accessibility into the regional member countries. So the target was, as I said, to reach around around 20 million farmers on the continent, and supply this input to ICT platform. And this also, as we are now the mid journey of this facility, is expected to last for 2 years because it's the emergency nature of it. And we are now, as I said, we started in South Hemisphere where the season was done last year. Now this year was the Northern Hemisphere. And as we conclude, now we are now to say that so far around 8 million food metric tons of food are being produced, and that is being going on. So now more figures will come the next year as we look at the mostly farmers benefiting from these inputs, fertilizer and seed, and also looking to the production, and also how we can respond to that for volatility on price on the market. So this is what I can say about this facility. And we'll be also happy as the bank to recognize our other development partners and the countries that came together to support this facility, namely the Japan, Norway, the Republic of Germany, and as we look at to the Netherlands and also the United States of America. So all contributed also to this the facility to around 320 million USD. So that's what I can say. So as I said, going forward, we'll be looking to the impact figures in terms of production and also productivity that contributed this facility across the continent. So this is what I can say on this facility, and maybe when you allow, I'll come later on the TAT program.
Yeah, we'll speak about Tata in a bit. But so is it right to say that in terms of disruptions, did you see disruptions in inputs? I mean, what sort of disruptions? Did you see the availability of inputs was lessened? Did you see an increase in the price of these inputs? What were the disruptions that you saw following the conflict? I mean,
the issue was mostly on the price and the timely availability, because not only that, because through what we call the African Fertilizer IFFM program, the African Fertilizer program that you have also at the bank, we were able to mobilize all these major suppliers of fertilizer on the continent to address this. But mostly the issue was the high price and also availability. So by availing these resources to regional member countries and working with the private sector and through the existing framework within the countries, specifically the subsidy scheme, we're able to supply on time. Because I will report to this, because normally to have a project approved at the bank, it goes through the almost 9 to even 12 months. But this particular, the bank was internally, the board was understanding, and this was approved and availed this resource to regional member countries to respond immediately to this emerging issue. And that's something also I wanted to report what you rightly said. Thank you, Omar.
Thank you. Dr. Matai, if I can go to you. I believe that, President Ruto held the Africa Climate Summit last month in Nairobi. He spoke of climate change and the real impact of climate change in Kenya, but throughout the region. We know of the droughts that you are suffering there. He estimated that the death of livestock alone is probably worth $1.5 billion loss in terms of GDP. And really, from my perspective, when we look at the conflict in Russia and Ukraine, we already saw tectonic shifts in the way the world is being reconfigured. But really what we saw to some extent double standards from the West. I mean, we see double standards from the West on a frequent basis, but we saw double standards from the West, and all of a sudden, the ones that are telling us to transition, and rightly so, to greener energies, but all of a sudden they're now reinvesting in fossil fuels. They're building coal plants. They're prioritizing energy security. Deadlines are being pushed back in terms of their targets, and ultimately, it's what this will do. It will only aggravate the impact of climate change on the continent. So you must be worried.
Well, that's Omar. That's a great picture painted, one of great concern. Obviously, thank you for having me. And really, Innocent has painted a very important picture there. The Africa Climate Summit was important for many reasons, and you mentioned it. So I want to start there. I think part of the challenge for Africa right now is that this narrative has to be redefined in our own words, and I think, and on our own terms. If we continue to follow what someone else is doing, and therefore this is what we must do, we may miss the boat, especially on energy. I think there are real signals that Africa's opportunity to invest in renewables, regardless of what anybody else does, is still the most important opportunity we have. The greatest solar potential in the world, 60% of the world's best solar potential is found on the continent. We know that in a carbon constrained world, this is the direction the world is going. So we mustn't be distracted. We mustn't be distracted, because never on the planet will we ever produce oil at a cost that is competitive in a carbon constrained world. So we will be stranded with assets that we cannot afford. I think on the issue of energy, we must begin to look at Africa's energy security like everybody else. And that's why the Africa Climate Summit was such a pivotal moment of Africa saying, this is what we can do. This is our opportunity for us to transform our economies and transform lives and livelihoods on the continent. But by the way, in so doing, there are real opportunities for the rest of the world to be part of a decarbonization agenda that helps them, that Africa actually provides an opportunity for the rest of the world in a way we have never considered before. That's the real opportunity here, both on energy, but also on food. You know, the food situation to me is really in some ways quite sad. We know that for many of us, we realize how much we rely on Ukraine and other parts of the world when the wars come and the shocks happen. But the truth is, for most of the rest of the world, intra-regional trade is extremely high. It's not the case for Africa. We have a situation where only 16% of our trade on the continent is within ourselves. That's why AFTA is such an important opportunity, that we lean in and activate the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. It should not be cheaper for any African country to import rice or water from outside of the continent. It should make financial sense that our trade is boosted intra-Africa, 15% on the continent or 16, 80% in Europe, intra-European trade, 60% in Asia. We have some serious room to make there. And these are the real opportunities for Africa to build real lasting resilience by investing in our brilliance, in the God-given opportunities of a youth demographic that is extremely entrepreneurial, an opportunity where renewable energy is abundant. We have to turn all of these assets to work for Africa first. And that's the real opportunity here, Omar.
Thank you, Boaz. Maybe I can go to you in terms of when you look at the past few years. So since COVID, so that's one shock. Then we had the Ukraine crisis being a second shock. We've also got the ongoing shock of climate change, and I know you're working towards COP28 in terms of developing a sustainable food systems ecosystem. So in terms of the shocks, first of all, I mean, are you seeing greater resilience on the continent, or actually are you seeing these shocks and increase of price of over 20% in terms of staple food prices in sub-Saharan Africa, according to the IMF, increase in fuel, increase in the cost of fertilizers, climate change having an increasing impact in terms of agriculture production? Are you? I mean, what's your take in terms of, or when you take stock of the situation, what's your take in terms of our food resilience?
Thanks so much, Omar. Thanks for having me. And I think my colleagues, both Mathai and Innocent, have really, really articulated the issues so well. But let's just go back and look at the numbers, what we have on the continent. We just concluded the United Nations General Assembly spoke very clear about how the continent and also the entire world is not on track to achieve the SDG goals. For Africa, the CADA Biennial Review report are also showing that the continent is not on track to achieve the CADA goals and the targets. So basically, from a food security perspective, we are really in a bad shape. For the FAO report recently that was published, the 2022 SOFI report, the State of Food and Nutrition Security report, was showing that over 783 million people are going to bed without food. And remember, the numbers are also very, very clear about this. The consumption of food that's required on the continent is much more than what the production figures are showing us, meaning that it's very likely that if we just do business as usual, the continent will not be on track to achieve. People will be increasing in terms of those who go to bed without food. And what does this mean from a climate change perspective? I think we just need to note that the shocks that have hit the continent and hit the global world are actually really exacerbating the problem. The challenge is increasing. Look at the numbers that you just indicated in your introduction. $50 billion annually being used to import food. Over 28 billion of this is for North Africa. 22 billion is from sub-Saharan Africa. So we spend a lot of resources to import the food that we could have actually produced on the continent. The four major staples, wheat, rice, maize, soybean, actually only that 34 billion is used to import those major staples. These are commodities that can be produced on the continent without even just looking for somewhere in the rest of the world. So I think, Omar, as you just noted, the challenge is bigger. But again, with the coming of the climate change, with the coming of other shocks, we need to do business differently. The continent is increasing production at some stage, but more forests are being cut. What Mathai was just explaining, how the whole climate challenge is going to exacerbate the food security challenge. So cutting forests, degrading wetlands is not going to help. So business as usual is not going to help the continent, because these shocks are going to happen even much more than what we are seeing. Beyond climate change, there is price shocks, as you've rightly noted. There is COVID just hit the other day. Nobody ever knew that it would come from a different form of a shock. So building resilience of Africa's households to withstand and respond to shocks has to be at the center of every individual, of every leader, of every actor in every sphere that we are in. Because it's not just somebody's role alone. It's everybody, including us, to make sure that we are taking action differently. And just make an additional point there is there are lots of opportunities that Africa needs to really be able to do. We are confronted with an issue here where the Africa's continental policy framework will be ending by 2025, and therefore a huge opportunity to make a very robust food security plan for the continent that surpasses and goes beyond what we've been doing as business as usual. Looking at the demographics and the population dynamics, I think we have really, as a continent, to do more than what we are doing today. We have really to look at the major food producers on the continent. We have to look at the demand centers. We have to look at the growth corridors, be able really to produce food and avoid mistakes that have been done by the West, where you can increase production productivity at the expense of the environment, cutting forests, degrading wetlands, but also emitting all greenhouse gas emissions into the space. So I think it is a huge opportunity for the continent to look at the challenges. It's embarrassing for the continent to really make sure that to see people going to bed without hunger because of a failure of a rainy season. Where countries like in the Arab countries are able to feed their own people, and yet they never have rain. It's embarrassing for the continent. So we have really to do things differently to be able to reverse this trend.
Look, there's a lot to unpack there, Boaz. One of them is about developing agriculture sustainably, and we'll get to that in a second. I mean, is it an oxymoron? Can you develop agriculture sustainably at scale? And maybe we'll ask yourself and Wanjira to respond to that a bit later. So, but one question I will ask you, actually, a follow-up question. I mean, you mentioned that you were at the UN General Assembly. So when you look at our policymakers, what was their main concern? I mean, was the issue of food security one at the table there? Was the issue of conflict resolution on the table there, given the disproportionate impact that it's having on our purses on the continent?
Thank you so much. I was in New York during the UN General Assembly, and I spent most of the time listening, following leaders' messages, leading leaders. And one of the biggest innovations for this particular United Nations General Assembly that we just concluded in September was that the UN Secretary General dedicated special sessions to look at food security and food systems for the global world. So we were able to see leaders gather. But one of the very shocking revelations was really to see that almost all the countries in the world are not on track to achieve the SDG goals and targets. Although the discussion was around the SDGs, but we discovered that actually food systems transformation can actually impact on almost each of the 17 SDG goals. And this was reiterated by leaders. They would speak really around issues related to climate, issues related to food waste, issues related to environment, issues related to health of individuals. That can actually be responded to if you are transforming food systems very robustly. I think for me, what did not come out very well was the kind of solution that we're being brought on the table. Because if you look at the global political dynamics, there is a lot that needs to be done. If you see how it hit in the Russia-Ukraine crisis or in the COVID crisis, as Innocent was explaining, the disruption in the food supply chains could actually be responded to if leaders and those policymakers are able to really put in robust policies that can allow easy movement of goods and services, remove all these trade restrictions to allow production to be able to move from surplus areas to deficit areas at a cost-effective manner. And for me, again, wearing an African hat under the UN General Assembly, it was so touching to see that the numbers for people who are going to bed without food are increasing, and yet the solutions actually rely on the continent. And for me, it's a challenge for the African leaders to be able to make sure that we put in robust plans that are beyond just business as usual, as I was saying earlier.
So, Dr. Gitura, I mean, you're a professor in international relations. So, I mean, really, and my take is what we're going to see is a continuation of crisis. I mean, that's been the normal over history. We've seen crisis after crisis. So we need to be able to respond to them and build resilience. But ultimately, what do you see the role of really policymakers and leaders? Should they be involved in conflict resolution outside of our borders? Should we be focusing on our own conflict resolution, such as places like Sudan and others? Because the Sudan in itself could be a breadbasket for the region. What's your take there in terms of global geopolitics or this world of polycrises, let's say, and how best to adapt or what we can do about it?
Yeah, thanks, Omar, for having me, and that's a very nice question. Truth be told, we'll always have world crises one after another. If it's not the Russia-Ukraine, now we have Israel-Hamas. Next, it's going to be somebody else. But more importantly, coming back to the issue of food security, I like what all my previous presenters have said, and they're experts in their field. 60% of the most viable agricultural land is situated in Africa. 60% of all arable, the best land for agriculture is in Africa. But like you've come to rightly say it, geopolitics affects our food security. And I'll just give you, like you mentioned, South Sudan. Let's take a country like South Sudan. South Sudan has a landmass, agricultural landmass that is very fertile, very huge, but they have not fully developed the agricultural sector. Why? They rely on oil, rentierism. Their government policy is about getting the oil. That is easy money that they can get. And instead of pumping and using this money to develop the agricultural sector, the leaders don't do it. We look at bad governance and bad politics in Africa. I don't want to remind you guys about Zimbabwe and what the late Robert Mugabe did. Zimbabwe was actually the breadbasket of East and Central Africa. What does he go ahead and do? Take away all these big farms and cut them up into small pieces of land. And then all of a sudden now we lost that huge breadbasket for Africa. So a lot of bad governance on the African continent exacerbates issues and the crises that we are facing right now. Surprisingly enough, when the Russia-Ukraine war broke out, yes, we took a hit in terms of the fertilizers and the grains we would get. But I've not heard anybody talking about China, which produces over 20.6% of the world's cereals. It actually produces China is not at war with anybody else. Why couldn't Africa quickly adapt and start getting and using China as an alternative to import food from China? So you kind of see that our leaders and the policies they put around food security get affected by geopolitics. And like I'll keep on saying, we'll always have another crisis. If it's not the Israel-Hamas, it's going to be something else, probably in the Middle East or in Brazil, where we get most of our sugar from sometimes. So African leaders need to start looking inwardly in how Africa can become food secure, self-sufficient, self-resilient, so that we are not held at the mercy of everybody else's war outside there. That's my take. So we're not about to see the end of crises. Africa needs to wake up. I echo what all my previous presenters have said. Africa needs to wake up. Our leaders need to wake up and find out how can we just try and grow our own, how can we put policies and grow our own food? How can we become food secure as a continent?
Yeah, Innocent will be able to give us a few tips on building food security. But before that, I mean, I want to go to you, Wanjira. So obviously the population of the continent is going to increase rapidly, let's say double in the next 50 years, whatever you want to look at in terms of stats. I don't believe in extrapolation, but it's going to grow pretty quickly. I mean, we talk about 60% of arable land. Boaz talks of doing this thing sustainably. Ultimately, we can't just go about cutting forests and using land in an aggressive manner like they have in Brazil to drive their industrial and agricultural growth. So, I mean, does it worry you in terms of when you say, okay, look, we obviously got a food crisis, or we need to be food secure, but how do we do it sustainably? I mean, are you seeing examples of things being done sustainably? I know that OCP, who's a big fertilizer producer, is looking at producing green fertilizers, so to speak. But what's your take there in terms of when you look at the problem, not necessarily a paradox, but you've got two contradictory issues. You want to preserve the planet, but at the same time, you want to give people food on the table and opportunity.
Good point. I mean, I think this is why the paradigm itself has to shift, right? We know, for example, on food, we waste 30% of food that's produced in how we handle and how we store. And so there are real opportunities to do better. And at the World Resources Institute, we have this emerging paradigm that we're talking quite a bit about around our food, land, and water program. We call it the produce, protect, reduce, restore. How we produce food going forward in more regenerative, restorative ways is really important. We know that traditional knowledge systems have a lot to teach us about how we can produce what is good for us, what is good for the climate in the different regions, and that we actually can consume and rediscover some of the magic of the foods. It's not a secret that for many of us on the African continent, when we are not feeling well, we eat traditional food. We will revert to some of our traditional vegetables, our traditional beverages, just because we know intuitively, and we've been taught it, handed down from generations, just how healthy those foods are. So how we produce food in the future, more regenerative, more circular, using land more effectively, is something we need to look for. And this is something Boaz and Edgar and Innocent, everyone here knows really well, that there's a lot of energy going into how we do that. How we protect the landscapes that are critical for biodiversity, for water. And you know that for me, this is an area that is personally crucially important. The Africa Restoration Initiative, 750 million hectares available for restoration, that actually, if we restore the most critical ecosystems among us, we know that that will have huge dividends for water, for biodiversity, for food, for climate, all the above. So we have to redouble our efforts to produce and protect and restore the landscapes that need restoration, even as we protect landscapes like the Congo Basin, and in each of our countries, crucial landscapes that we know, wetlands that were so inspired by what's going on in Rwanda, for example, the reclamation of wetlands, because they have such an important role to play. So you see, produce, protect, reducing waste, as I said before, and adopting circularity. In fact, I am always inspired. Almost every culture on the African continent has a circular story to tell, how we used things and reused them, how we use things that come from nature. It was such a big part of that. In Rwanda, when they banned plastic, all these beautiful baskets emerged that are part of the culture. The same thing happening on the African continent. There are real opportunities in the produce, protect, reduce, restore metaphor, and in that paradigm. And I think that is part of what we have to embrace as we look into the future.
Fantastic. So, Boaz, maybe you can add to that. I mean, are we seeing these things done on a large scale, or is it still on a very small scale and therefore not necessarily practical for the continent's needs?
I think what Mathai is absolutely right, and she's hitting the nail on the topic directly. Because I think the continent, the opportunities are so huge, but as people have already said, you cannot eat the opportunities. We just have to tap into the innovations that we already have. Let me just try to unpack. When we talk about increasing production or productivity sustainably, what does that mean from where I come from? Today, and the numbers have been out clear, indicating that when you increase rice production, you can actually even be contributing to the global greenhouse gas emissions. carbon dioxide that goes into the space because of intensification of use of fertilizer can actually increase. Methane itself that disrupts the ozone layer will increase because you are increasing livestock production. But this does not mean that you need to really compromise production and productivity of livestock, of rice, of wheat, by increasing the emission in the greenhouse gas emissions. I think what we studied and we saw from what happened in countries like Vietnam, you can actually increase land intensification, optimize water use less synthetic fertilizer in a way that you can actually be able to increase the yields without extensively using fertilizer in an unsustainable way. You will reduce greenhouse gas emissions. You will actually protect the ozone layer. You allow the environment to regenerate. You can actually create some water systems and reservoirs and forests where you dig and cultivate in some of the watersheds and some of the land, increase the yields without disrupting the environment and climate. Because if you don't, it will hit us. So for me, it is possible that the continent can actually double or triple yields of maize, of wheat, of soybean without extensive and intensification that we have seen what happened in the rest of the world. We know, and I know that the global world has been challenging Africa. How can you just go more than double production and use more fertilizer? We haven't reached 50 kilograms per hectare that the Abuja Declaration made. The rest of the world is using 250 kilograms per hectare. They are trying to talk about reducing fertilizer use when Africa has not even reached where we need it to be. But I think the message that is coming out there is not to be defensive as a continent, is be able to say we can actually begin to apply fertilizer. We're talking about soil health. And I think the point that Mathai is talking about, regenerating our soils, creating the right carbonization, decarbonizing the entire environment, be able to allow that fertilizer can actually be used less if you protect your soils extremely so well to allow production productivity to increase. It's actually possible. What we need is big, huge, robust, unapologetic policies that leaders actually be able to say, we will actually establish a large-scale rice intensification with better water optimization, tap into the right sources of water without really degrading the environment. Those scientists have been able to tell us about how that can be done. There's a lot of stories, a lot of very good literature that has actually been discovered. We have excellent brains on the continent. I think there's no excuse for Africa not to be able to double production productivity without disrupting the environment. It's possible. All we need is a robust plan that all leaders have to sign to. And I'm glad that soon you'll be hearing some of the leaders meeting at the regional level to really make sure that they are bringing their heads together, their minds together to be able to create those solutions. And then the science will be able to do their work very efficiently. We need a robust plan for the continent.
And Bert, you said that you guys are hosting you're hosting a pavilion at the upcoming COP. So, and you're going to talk about African success stories and looking at the whole sort of food system ecosystem and climate. I mean, are we seeing interesting case studies there in terms of enhancing the food system in a climate conscious way?
Just a big credit, especially to the UAE, the presidents of COP28, by really raising the profile of food systems in the entire COP agenda. I think this is a huge opportunity. We know that this discussion started with Sharm el-Sheikh in COP27 and other previous COPs, but it wasn't raised to the profile where it has already been brought at a level where the discussions of responding to climate challenge has to also be borne in mind in terms of what food systems has to offer in terms of responding to the climate challenge. So we've been approached as an organization to work with the rest of the African institutions and actors and partners really to put a pavilion at the COP28 to be able to showcase models and approach of countries that have demonstrated progress. We have a few countries that since the Food Systems Summit that have really developed robust plans that speak to the climate agenda, increasing production productivity. For example, small-scale irrigation facilities that the private sector can invest in, where the government can bring in branded financing mechanisms. So those such models exist in Rwanda, in Malawi, in Ghana, in Tanzania, is making a very robust plan on how actually you can actually boost production productivity. So at the COP28, at the Africa Pavilion, the intention is really to bring these countries to demonstrate what does it mean to raise production productivity without disrupting the environment. We also want to make sure that countries are able to tap into the global financing systems that are showing up. The Global Green Growth Institute is announcing over $150 billion to invest in African Middle East countries that are really developing robust plans of a climate-sensitive agenda, speaking from a food systems perspective. The Green Climate Fund has also raised some resources to make sure that they're incentivizing countries that are putting in place a lot of models and efforts to drive the food systems agenda. I think the efforts are out there. We need to make sure that countries that are demonstrating progress are incentivized to be able to show that is happening, and they'll be able to raise the rest of the continent to respond to the food security agenda. So COP28 offers that opportunity for us to be able to show those models the countries have started putting in place.
Excellent. And maybe we'll go to Innocent to talk to us a little bit about TAT and what you're doing to increase yields and the pilot projects that you ran in the Horn of Africa. I'm aware of some pilot projects in the Horn of Africa, but I'm not. Maybe there are others elsewhere. But really, in terms of those pilots, I mean, how do you intend to scale them up? Is it possible to scale them up on a continent-wide basis? And how do you think they'll contribute to improving and increasing food security?
Thank you, Omar, and many thanks to my colleagues, Boaz and Edgar Wanchit. I think there is. I want to come back to one thing that was said at the beginning, being you or Boaz and the colleagues. It's about really we need to move in a business as usual. So we need to do things differently. And we keep saying that, and we need really to do on this continent differently. And I will just give an example of this particular program that the bank initiated back in 2019. That is called a Technology for African Agriculture Transformation Program. The purpose is actually to set up a partnership framework that brings together the leading institution in the science domain, and specifically also putting in place a delivery mechanism of this proven technology. So and then you all see, and I wanted really to come back to what my brother Boaz said in terms of productivity and sustainable productivity. So we have all what it takes to do so. So we know we have this knowledge, skills, technology, and resources, human. So we need to do that productivity in a sustainable manner, and that's indeed the purpose of TAT. So is to increase agriculture productivity across African countries by deploying proven agriculture technologies to the farmers. So the concept is actually to say, let's feed our continent, and with let's feed our continent, let's get to the hands of our millions of farmers with this proven technology to increase productivity. And the concept being also on agroecologic zones that transact the national boundaries. That is really that essence on that nature. And that bringing together, let's give some example, maize, compact, rice, wheat in the Horn of Africa, that I give an example, cassava technologies that you have being from the seed, the good agriculture practices, the technology in terms of post-harvest. We have all it takes to really revolutionize our agriculture by doing business differently. And in this particular case, I'll give one example where by working together with government, we're able to really revolutionize. And I'll give an example of wheat in Ethiopia. It is just figures that will speak itself, whereby with the high commitment from the policy makers and putting together the resources, bringing these science and technologies, we are able to really revolutionize the wheat sector in Ethiopia. So with just, I will give chronologically what happened is just by deploying the heat-tolerant wheat variety in the Ethiopia, because we need to make that a nuance, that to understand the importance of the science. The fact that the science came up with that heat-tolerant wheat variety was making possible to produce wheat in a lowland in Ethiopia, which was not there before. But with that fact of having this heat-tolerant wheat variety through that, and with that political will, commitment from Ethiopia, in 2018 to 2019, it moves from 5,000 hectares to 180,000 hectares in 2021, and again increase to 650,000 hectares in 2022. It indicates how the putting together that political commitment and putting the science, we can really revolutionize. And the yield increased from 2 metric tons per hectare to 4 metric tons per hectare. So, and this is what we are working, as you rightly said, Omar. These are success stories that we are packaging and also working with different government. And currently we're working with the government of Tanzania, whereby the promotion of the seed production and also promoting the wheat program is coming out, referring to the a good example of Ethiopia. So this is a kind of example that I just give as on wheat. I give the same, as I said, that covers a number of commodity compact, maize, cassava, sorghum and millet, aquaculture, livestock, all that to have a package of proven technologies that have been tested, and now it's matter of scaling to the regional member countries. So with that TAT program, working with different partners, and specifically in this case that I'm with my colleague here, working with AGRA, because the productivity will not happen only with the seed or efficient use of fertilizer. It's go together with all the agriculture practices, water, soil, but also the conducive environment. That's in that perspective that the bank, working together with AGRA and other regional economic blocks, we are facilitating the policy reform, specifically to domesticate and having this harmonization regulations of seed or inputs in the different agroecologies to facilitate the easy movement of all these inputs. So it's all about bringing together all this package, having this political commitment, working together as region. And my sister said it at the beginning with this African trade area, we need to operationalize it. And that's where is the movement of all this input. And then later, if production increases, it will let all this transboundary movement of goods, it will be easier. That's also another factor as driving. So to cut the story short, with that TAT program, bringing together innovation and technology, working together with international Research Institute and the National Research Institute to avail this technology to millions of farmers, and going through mostly with the working together, the private sector, different partners across to make this happening, has made really this example I've just mentioned on wheat, have on maize and a different part of the continent. I would say, for example, when back in around 2019, 20, where the heat, the drought hit the Southern Africa, TAR deployed drought-tolerant maize variety, which were cultivated and helped to on around 1 million hectares, and that will help farmers to really using this the drought heat tolerant maize that able to survive on this drought. So this is really something that we needed to do differently by working together with science provider, the private sector, and then also with that political will, creating environment that will help all this to happen and really address the issue of low productivity and African becoming self-sufficient. And you have all to take, as my colleagues said, and you can do in a sustainable manner, as we said before. So this is what my contribution, Omar, in terms of what we are doing in terms of addressing the issue of low productivity on the continent through the Technology for African and Cultural Transformation Program, through a partnership of science providers and availing the climate smart technology to the hands of million farmers. Over.
Thank you very much for that. And I had followed actually the TAPT case study, or the pilot in. I mean, it's more than a pilot actually. I mean, pilot for me is on a small scale. I mean, all you guys have done is hundreds of thousands of hectares in terms of growth. So from 5,000 to 650,000 hectareage, it's pretty transformational at scale. I'm going to go back to geopolitics and to you, Dr. Gitua. I mean, there was an interesting story actually. I met the deputy central bank governor of Boaz's home country, from Uganda. He's a fantastic chap and really one of the most respected central bank or deputy central bank governors there and on the continent. And he was saying, so we were talking about inflation. Inflation. This was back in this is before the conflict, I think, in Russia. It's about February 2022. So he was talking about inflation, food inflation, etc. He said, look, actually, Ugandans consume a lot of foods produced locally, which means that actually that we've been pretty resilient to increase in global food prices, and so that's been that's a positive. And then in terms of most of the staples were produced locally. Then when I saw him a few months later, and I was saying, okay, so you must still be happy that you're not being impacted by the food prices. And he said, actually, food prices have actually gone up for two reasons. One is climate change. Actually, a drought had impacted yields, but also higher cost of fuel and general devaluations in the region, so local currency depreciations, as well as higher fertilizer and input costs. So ultimately, the impact of the crisis in Ukraine at the time had ramifications on his on inflation, and therefore having to raise interest rates, increasing the cost of capital, making it harder for SMEs and those who can't afford it to borrow money, etc., etc. So there are ramifications in terms of these exogenous shocks. So really the question to you is those ramifications are real and are again disproportionate in terms of the impact on our people on the continent. So have we seen a failure of leadership ultimately to try and resolve this issue in Africa, not taking positions, and lack of leadership on the international stage generally in terms of global geopolitics?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks so much for the way you've put it. I mean, for the Ugandan case, of course, yeah, Ugandans consume a lot of their food. I mean, it's a very fertile, beautiful country. But eventually, remember, they are also a net importer of fuel. So, and Russia being one of the biggest, exporters of fuel in the world, that was going to definitely hit them at some point. But more so to your question is failure of leadership from my perspective, from where I sit in terms of just preparing Africa and making Africa resilient to some of these shocks that come. I mean, if we have, I know we can start a conversation and probably not be able to end this. Nigeria is one of the world's biggest producers of crude oil, and we know that. Now, why is Africa suffering because of fuel from Russia? Why don't we get our fuel from Nigeria? Let's ask, just as African Union, as African leaders, let's ask that question. Why couldn't Nigeria, why hasn't Africa developed to the point, or why have African leaders not thought about, why can't Nigeria, number one, produce oil for Africa? Why can't we get our oil from Libya? All right. Why do we have to be caught in the crossfire of what happens between the Russia-Ukraine war? All those kinds of things. We look at countries like Congo. Let's look at countries like Congo. That's a huge country by size. The constant conflicts within Congo, the lack of, proper leadership, governance within Congo, that is another potential breadbasket for Africa, probably even the world. If you just imagine the kind of land that is uncultivated in that side. So all these negative geopolitics where African leaders, we find ourselves being reactionary. We are not proactive. So my clarion call, and I keep on saying that we just need to have better policymakers in terms of, this was a wake-up call for us. COVID-19 happened and we realized we can get caught. This Russia-Ukraine war has also showed us that on some of these big commodity prices for food, we will get caught. Like all my colleagues have been saying, we need to become resilient. We need to put in policies. The political goodwill needs to be there. We have a case study of Malawi years back in 2012. Through subsidies, they were able to turn around their situation and became, food sufficient, maize sufficient. But then some mismanagement along the chain led them back. Now they're in food insecure. So you ask ourselves, why is it that we have the know-how to do this, but we don't have the political goodwill on the continent to carry out some of these policies? So I believe Africa can get better prepared. We have all these brains that have all these policies. It is the lack of political goodwill in our leaders that makes us lag behind. So business, I'll echo what Innocent and what Boaz and what Wanjira have said. It cannot be business as usual if Africa wants to get out of this, quagmire that we find ourselves in.
Fantastic. And but do you think conflicts around the world, including the Ukraine-Russia conflict, will delay Africa reaching the SDGs? I mean, do we live in a more complicated geopolitical environment right now?
Yeah, true. Granted, what we import from Russia and Ukraine in terms of grains, edible oils, fuel, we can't replace that gap. And we have agricultural experts here who can probably back me up, or probably if I'm on the wrong side, they can set the record straight. I don't see us closing that gap in the next 2-3 years. It's not an overnight thing to do. This thing, we've been caught behind the curveball. It's happened to us. Unless we can, for example, in my view, divert our sources, extra food sources to, let's say, China, if at all they'll agree to come in, get our other food sources from other places. If we are only going to sit there waiting for Russia and Ukraine to provide for us the fertilizers and the grains and the cereals that we need, remembering there are bigger places like the Middle East that require that, cereals and the wheat more than we do, or consume more than we do, have more money than we have, Africa is going to be in trouble. If we are sitting here waiting that we're going to get those grains from there, it's going to be another maybe 2-3 years before we catch up. And I don't see us closing that gap soon. Over maybe to Boaz and Wanjira to try and just set that record straight, but I see we are way behind that curve.
And so to you, Boaz, I mean, will the current conflict in Ukraine, Russia Has it changed geopolitics to such an extent and disrupted markets that it could delay Africa reaching the SDGs?
I think what Edgar is saying is partly true, but I would just wanted to put it a little bit different, Edgar, here. Look at what Ethiopia did in the last 3 seasons on wheat production, using own resources from renaissance money. They were able to more than triple wheat production, not only to feed Ethiopia's wheat needs, because Ethiopia used to be the largest importer of wheat, because they take a lot of, of bread and the rest. But Ethiopia now has a wheat surplus. It is actually possible if people make robust, tough decisions. The things that we've just mentioned, maize. Nigeria is the largest producer of rice in West Africa, actually on the continent. Nigeria has the potential to triple rice production today within 3, 4, 5 seasons. All you need is to make sure that the seed systems are functioning, as Innocent was saying. The production, the distribution, the availability of seed in the right manner is actually within the hands of Africans. 2, you need to make sure that the markets are functioning. And markets in the sense that road, rail, port infrastructure to increase the profitability to be able to move these surplus production to deficit areas. Ethiopia combined with South Sudan and partly some of the Kenyan countries can actually produce wheat that can supply the East and Southern Africa continent. So if bring in Zimbabwe, Zambia, South Africa, with maize production and wheat production, this continent can feed itself and be a net, not only a net producer, but a net exporter of these products we're talking about within 3 seasons. It is possible. But as everybody has said, it has to take robust decisions. Maybe when we use the word policies, sometimes people misunderstand, just put in place a law, a regulation. Big decisions of saying, let's stop importing wheat on the continent. 5 countries combined can feed Africa with wheat needs. I know it's a challenge if you go to countries like Nigeria, like Egypt, like Morocco. They have also put in big plans because they are importing cheaper wheat from Russia, Ukraine areas because the deep sea transport costs are much more relatively easier compared to when you get that wheat from Southern Africa, if you just use as an example. But the decision that allow, for example, containers that come from that part of the region to go back with some piece of productivity surpluses, the continent can actually feed itself. It takes a season, 2 seasons, 3 seasons away from actually reverting back to building resilient food systems on the continent. It is possible.
Thank you, Boaz. We're running out of time. So, Wanjiro, if I can come to you, just a very quick answer, if you can. But ultimately, has the Ukraine-Russia crisis and the global geopolitics derailed the climate agenda from your perspective?
Well, listen, I completely agree with what my brothers have said, come before, that there are real opportunities given what we know. The one factor that I think, in addition to what has been mentioned, is finance. We need significant quality finance at the speed and quality that will make a difference to build energy systems to where irrigation functions and all our seed systems function. We need storage. We are seeing so much waste happening at handling and storage, and that's also because of cold storage and others, transportation systems, infrastructure. All of that requires a significant amount of finance. It is no surprise, therefore, that the global financial architecture is at the center of discussions by our leaders about what is needed fundamentally to allow Africa to unleash the potential that we've all been discussing here today. It is unconscionable that Africa would pay 8 times more for finance because of an Africa dividend that is focused or based on a historical past rather than the promise of the future. That's the sort of partnership that Africa is looking for as we move forward, because we cannot have a situation where we are constantly trying to make decisions whether to build infrastructure or pay debts. There's a whole historical discussion around the Bretton Woods institutions and why they were put in place in the first place, where countries were given significant fiscal space so that they could rebuild after the wars. This is a crisis situation, and at least for African countries and African leaders, I applaud them for pushing hard on the fiscal unfair fiscal systems that hold us hostage, because you cannot do any of what we're talking about without the finance at quality and velocity and quantity that is transformative.
Thank you, Wanjiro. I'm being told to wrap up, so I wanted to thank all my panelists. Thank you, Innocent, and thank you for your time and for making this panel. Thank you, Boaz. Thank you, Wanjira. Thank you, Dr. Gitua. So this was on the record, so we'll be publicizing this post-event, and we thank you for your participation. The road is long, but we have no alternative but
No alternative.
our own
No,
solutions.
Absolutely.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Very good.
All right.
Thank you so
And
much.
as I
Thank you
said
for
in
having
the
us.
chat box, the really momentum of Dakar too, we need to help these countries to keep this momentum, commitment. For
Yeah.
that really is to become self-reliant Africans, and we are capable, and we have examples that are happened that's possible. So anyway, thank you guys. All great talking to you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you
Thank
for
you.
having me.
everyone.
Thank you.